Dear Chris, please forgive me, but I cannot return to you your Mishima books. I will have new ones sent to you once I come ashore. I barely had the time to pack, even less time and courage to say goodbye. I will do my best to retrace my line of thoughts that have led me to this current journey, and hope you understand the reasoning behind my action. I discovered the sea of fertility when I was 19, living in Paris, and I devoured the tautology along with Yukio Mishima's other written works. When I met you, almost a decade later, on another continent, I was prompted by my research on my great-granduncle and the Siamese Revolution of 1932, faintly recalling one of the books mentioning the revolution, to ask you to borrow them. While reading your copy of Spring Snow, at the height of the novel's climax, where Kiyoaki and Satoko were to meet for one last time at the train station, a single torn piece of paper fell across the new page like a loose leaf. I was shaken by its apparition. It made me realize why one borrows books. To have, in front of one's eyes, the testimony of a living being who has touched it before us. The palpability of oil from human hands permanently permeated its pages. My own copies of Runaway Horses and The Decay of the Angel recently acquired a benediction of their own. The beloved Obi Bear, a restaurant beneath my studio, burned down. All my possessions, including these projectors and the 2 books, were shrouded in smoke and ash. The books became pivotal in my research, not just because of the content of its pages, but the fact that these very pages were touched by our hands. They mark our individual journeys that have led us to one another. Rereading Mishima is purely a work of desire. Who was I then? Who am I now? Who are you reading the same lines I have? It worked like a spell, you giving me 2 out of the 4 books, my dad bringing me the remaining 2 from my library in Paris. A Jean-Genesque talismanic crossing of borders. Both our copies are identical, published by Vintage International, New York, 1990. The cover of the first English translations was designed as rectangular boxes encasing the title and graphics of the books. A story within a story, a frame within a frame. My copies followed a worldwide redistribution back to Asia, where they were purchased again by the Japanese book-selling company Kinokuniya, exported to Thailand where I bought them, and brought to Paris, then brought back to the US by way of Los Angeles. It is particularly fitting to illustrate the cycle of reincarnations that preside over the 4 novels. The main character of each book would die at the age of 20 before reincarnating in the book that follows. From a young marquis son in 1912 to a post-revolution Thai princess who came to study in Japan in the 50s. The history of 20th century Japan and Thailand mirrored in one another, eerily reflecting my own past. Did I ever tell you how I discovered my great-grand-uncle's name in Runaway Horses, the second book of the tetralogy, in a passage where the narrator, Shigekuni Honda, attended a lecture at the Club of Foreign Affairs? It was there he learned about the Siamese Revolution of 1932. The revolution began and ended quietly on the bright morning of June 24th, without the citizens of Bangkok being aware of it. Launches and sampans thronged the Manam River as usual, and shouts of hagglers filled the marketplace. In government buildings, affairs crept on at the usual torpid pace. Only those citizens who went by the palace and noted how its appearance had altered during the night were aware that something was amiss. Tanks and machine guns commanded every approach, and soldiers with fixed bayonets halted any car that drew near. The lofty windows of the upper stories of the palace bristled with machine gun barrels, glittering in the sunlight. The King Rama VII was at the seaside resort of Bai In, together with the Queen. The country was an absolute monarchy. The members of the royal family and the officials who constituted them in support of the monarchy were brought to the palace one after the other, where they were gathered together to hear Colonel Pahan Ponpayasena, the leader of the coup d'etat, explain the ideology of the new government. The National Party had seized power, and a temporary government had been set up. This information was conveyed to the king himself, and after he had sent a wireless dispatch the following morning, indicating that he favored a constitutional monarchy, he returned to the capital by special train to be greeted by the cheers of the crowd. On June 26, Rama VII issued a proclamation approving the new government, immediately after receiving in audience the two young leaders of the National Party, Luang Pradit, a civilian, and Phayapahorn Phonphayosena. In his memoir, Ma vie mouvementée et mes 20 ans d'exil en Chine populaire, my great-grand-uncle explains his various names and titles. Luang Pradit, as Mishima called him, was the name that some Westerners, older now, know me under my old official title, which they transcribe sometimes as Luang Pradit or Luang Pradit Manutam, etc. The name that is most commonly used in English is Pridi Banomyong. This out-of-print memoir was written during his exile in communist China and published when he arrived in France by UNESCO and the Bangkok Post. My mother showed me the memoir around when I was first reading Mishima's tautology, but when I asked for it a couple of years later, she told me it had been lost. Surprisingly, shortly after I decided to borrow your Mishima books, the memoir resurfaced. This new copy was brought to her by her friend, a professor of anthropology at Thammasat University. Thammasat is the first open-door university of Thailand and one of the few remnants of Pridi's liberal politics that he instigated during his short term in government. You might have read these following lines in the third book of Mishma's tautology, The Temple of Dawn, describing a Bangkok that has already succumbed to dictatorship. The present monarch, Rama VIII, or King Ananda Mahidol, succeeded to the throne in 1935 at the age of 11, but he soon went to study in Lausanne, and now, at the age of 17, he is still there, devoted to his research. During his absence, the Prime Minister, Luang Pibun, assumed totalitarian powers, and now the nominal parliament serves merely in an advisory capacity. I've just been called to the palace, he said. I can't imagine why. The king is dead. He has been shot. Pridii, that whispered, had shot his monarch. Pibun had sent his gunmen to get him at his riverside home, and they had raked the front of his house with gunfire before bursting in. Pridii was relaxing in his pajamas. That burst of gunfire gave him the time he needed. He slipped out the back door and saw a sampan boat drifting lazily by. He hailed the boatman, jumped aboard, and got away across the river, still in his pajamas. His wife, Phoonsuk, woken by the commotion, came downstairs looking for him. "Where is he?" she asked. "He is gone, madam." Before she could press further, rain of gunshots shook the house. She ran upstairs to where her children were and shouted, "Stop shooting! There are only women and children here." "We're here to change the government," the voice in the megaphone replied back. "Then go change it, in Parliament." "The ocean. He must have got away in a boat." On the 6th of August 1949, Pridi escaped from Bangkok on a fishing boat, and never to return to Thailand in his lifetime. The whole city wondered where he was. At 6 o'clock in the morning a few days later, I could have told them. My valet woke me and said that there were some men in uniform at the door. I threw on a dressing gown, ran downstairs, and found a naval officer. The officer said, "Ruth is here. May he come in?" Ruth. That was the code name Pridi had used when he ran the Resistance, under the noses of the Japanese. I invited him in immediately. Pridi said, "I want to leave the country as quickly as possible. Can you arrange it?" The government had the land borders under strict surveillance, thus we chose the maritime route for our escape, although this route presented many risks, for we would have to cross various surveillance posts established at several places at the mouth of the great river Manam, which we would have to pass through to reach the sea. A friend placed at our disposal a little model trawler of 5 tons displacement. As the Siamese law does not allow fishing boats of less than 5 tons displacement registered in Bangkok to go beyond 250 kilometers along the maritime coast of the south, we would have to break the law to go even beyond 1,500 kilometers. One fine morning, when we had reached around 800 kilometers from Bangkok, I saw that there was a government gunboat ahead of us, anchored at the mouth of a small river on the coast. A single ship changed it all. The whole composition changed. With the rending of the whole pattern of being, a ship was received by the horizon. An application was signed. A whole universe was thrown away. A ship came in sight to throw out the universe that had guarded its absence. In such a situation, we were in great difficulty. If we continued on our route, we would doubtless be arrested by the gunboat. If we went back towards the north, the gunboat could be suspicious of us and fire on us. In both cases, we risked being arrested by the gunboat. A fishing boat came in from the west, as if to signal the opening of a ceremony. It was a poor little boat, and yet, wheelless and legless, it advanced with a proud grace, as if sweeping in, full-skirted. The stakes were situated between the gunboat and a trawler. Our captain steered our boat in the direction of the buoys, where we made fast while waiting for the arrival of the fishermen. By 3, the mackerel clouds grew thinner. On the southern sky, clouds fanned out like the tail of a white turtle dove to throw a deep shadow over the sea. As the sky clouded over, the sea fell into sulky contemplation, studded with fine nightingale-colored prints. It bristled with wave thorns like a rose branch. In the thorns themselves was evidence of a smooth becoming. The thorns of the sea were smooth. When they arrived, we brought some fish, so that the gunboat could be convinced that we had solely come here to do business with the local fishermen. After this camouflage, we turned our boat northward to give the appearance of returning to Bangkok. One fine morning, our steamer entered into the Road of Qingtao, where communist officials of the port came on board to welcome our passengers. In his 1965 audience with Chairman Mao, my great-grand-uncle expressed nostalgia for his homeland. "Where would you like to go?" the Supreme Leader asked, offering the whole world as a reconciliation for that one place he cannot go. Paris was my great-grand-uncle's second choice. Paris was where my father would visit him during his summer vacations, and where he would find him dead in his study at the age of 83. The next trip to Europe he took, he stayed instead with my future grandparents in Switzerland, and that was where he met my mother. After he completed his PhD in Oxford, he moved our family back to Paris, and both he and my mother continue to live there to this day. In our apartment, I grew up with the two armchairs, which are featured in a famed photograph of Pridi and my great-grand-aunt Phoonsuk Banomyong, sitting in their house in the suburb of Paris. I like to think of Pridi's memoir, Ma vie mouvementée, as the fifth book to Mishima's tetralogy. When Mishima did indeed finish the last book, Decay of the Angel, in 1970, he committed seppuku, and that was the year Pridi published his. Both view history as driven by cycles of reincarnations within one body, one consciousness, are contained centuries of all earthly desires unquenched. History thus progresses as a movement of return. For the last 5 years, I faced the Pacific and the fear of a return. What Pridi's ultimate desire is to return to a country that does not want him. I am choosing to stay away. We are placed in our respective positions by the desire to be recognized by the very forces that seek to undo us. a Thailand in the grips of pro-monarchy conservatism for Pridi, and the allure of Eurocentric white masculinity for me. The day I saw you last was so beautiful. The sun filled your mother's studio as we spoke in a quiet tone to each other. When I was leaving, you called out to me to wait up. The setting sun lit up your face as you told me that you would call. The beauty of an ending, unknown or unexpected then. I'll see you again beneath the falls. I let myself believe, and perhaps we both did, that it all was going to be okay, that we would just slip right back to where we were. Maybe I'll write to you again someday. There are so many things I didn't have time to say. Yet, maybe it is all irrelevant. In the absence of bodies, books still circulate as physical traces and living memory of those who are no longer here. You handed me your Mishima books and an inverted spring by the music building at UCLA. When I approached the destination, all I saw was a large stone basin and the sound of running water. You stood up from the bench where you sat waiting for me, and together we approached the water source. Torrents of water were gushing towards a hole. It was not a spring, but a waterfall. In Yushiki theory, the Japanese theory of samsara, or transmigration of souls, the waterfall symbolizes a concession of time where the past and present are simultaneous. This consciousness is in constant flux, like a foaming white waterfall. While the cascade is always visible to our eye, the water is not the same from minute to minute. New water insensibly pours by, streaming and surging, sending up its misty vapors. I learned that the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. named a subspecies of golden-fronted leafbird after my great-granduncle, Chloropsis Aurifrons Pridi. The bird's migratory pattern flies over the Himalayan chains, Sri Lanka, and back towards Southeast Asia.
Las piedras jamás